Before she could walk, the newspapers had already given her a name. They called her the richest little girl in the world. By the time she died, she had outlived two husbands, watched a man she knew for a decade get killed right outside the gates of her own estate, adopted a woman she believed was the reincarnation of her dead daughter, and left her entire billion-dollar fortune in the hands of her butler. A decision that sent armies of lawyers into battle for years. Doris Duke had everything money could buy. What she could never quite hold on to was something far more complicated than that. This is her story. The weight of a name. Doris Duke was born on November 22nd, 1912, in New York City, the only child of James Buchanan Duke and his second wife, Nanaline Holt Inman. From the first moment she drew breath, she was already famous for something she had not yet done: exist inside one of the greatest fortunes in American history. Her grandfather, Washington Duke, had built a thriving tobacco operation in North Carolina in the years after the Civil War. When his son James inherited it, he didn't simply continue what his father had started. He transformed it. James Duke formed the American Tobacco Company in 1890, consolidating the market in ways that made him one of the most powerful industrialists of his era. The government eventually forced the company to break apart under antitrust laws in 1911, but by then, the damage to his competition was done, and the fortune was made. James turned next to hydroelectric power and real estate, and the money kept compounding. By the time Doris was born, the family maintained estates that were less like houses and more like small sovereign territories. Duke Farms, in Hillsborough Township, New Jersey, covered 2,700 acres. Rough Point in Newport, Rhode Island, was a 49-room English manor-style mansion set above the Atlantic. There was a mansion on the Upper East Side of Manhattan that filled an entire city block. Moving between these properties required a full traveling staff. Growing up in them required learning to live inside something closer to a museum than a home. James Duke, for all of his formidable reputation, was genuinely devoted to his daughter. He took her seriously, spoke to her directly, and treated her as someone worth knowing rather than a social ornament. She adored him. On his deathbed in October 1925, when Doris was 12 years old, he reportedly told her to trust no one. A piece of advice that landed with the force it deserved, given everything that would come after. A week after his death, it became public that he had left the bulk of his estate to Doris and to the Duke Endowment, the charitable foundation he had established the year before. The fortune was estimated at around $100 million, a sum that, by even the most conservative measure, is worth well over $1 billion today. Doris became its primary heir at 12 years old. What nobody could plan for was what that inheritance did to her daily life. The press descended. Every birthday, every outing, every glimpse of her in public became material. She had bodyguards as a child. She was tutored privately to keep her out of schools where her presence would transform every classroom into a spectacle. She began receiving threatening letters that her father had apparently been intercepting for years. Letters that made clear, with brutal specificity, that there were people in the world who hated her simply for what she had been born into. She read those letters after he died, when the mail arrived without anyone to filter it first. Her mother, Nanaline, was not the protective sort. Their relationship was strained almost from the beginning. James Duke had left Nanaline a relatively modest trust fund. His real money went to Doris, and this imbalance coloured everything between mother and daughter. When Doris was 14, she took her own mother to court to prevent her from selling family assets. She won. When she later wanted to attend college, Nanaline refused. Instead, Nanaline took her on a grand tour of Europe and presented her as a debutante in London in 1930 at 18, the kind of social debut that was meant to signal availability to eligible men of the right kind. By her early 20s, Doris Duke had more money than nearly anyone alive, no formal education, a mother she didn't trust, a public that wouldn't leave her alone, and a father's warning ringing in her head. She was about to make her first marriage, and whatever else it was also an escape. Who she chose, why she chose him, and what that marriage actually looked like once the doors were closed. That story is more complicated than it first appears. The first marriage, James Cromwell. James Henry Roberts. Cromwell was 38 years old when he married Doris Duke on February 13th, 1935. She was 22. The age difference of 16 years was not, by the standards of the time, unusual for a woman of her position. What was unusual was the speed of the marriage and the nature of the man she had chosen. Cromwell came from a socially prominent background. His mother, Eva Stotesbury, was one of the great Palm Beach and Philadelphia society hostesses of the era, a woman whose parties were events and whose connections ran through the highest levels of American business and political life. His stepfather was the wealthy financier Edward T. Stotesbury. Cromwell had grown up surrounded by the trappings of great wealth, though by the time he married Doris, much of his family's own fortune had diminished. His first marriage, to Delphine Dodge, heiress to the automobile fortune, had ended in divorce in 1928, after 8 years. He had a daughter from that marriage, Christine, born in 1922. He was also politically ambitious in a way that, in hindsight, tells you almost everything you need to know about why he wanted to marry Doris Duke. He was a committed New Deal Democrat, a prolific author of political and economic pamphlets, and a man who had very clear ideas about the role he wanted to play in American public life. The problem was that ambition of that kind requires money, real, unencumbered money, and Cromwell's own resources were no longer equal to his aspirations. Doris's were. She gave him a monthly allowance of $10,000, roughly equivalent to $125,000 today, essentially from the beginning of the marriage. Her fortune financed his career. There was no ambiguity about this dynamic, and it is worth sitting with. The richest young woman in America married a man who needed her money to pursue goals that had nothing to do with her. The honeymoon was, at least in its early stages, genuinely romantic by any measure. The couple took a 2-year trip around the world, through Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and eventually the Pacific. For Doris, the journey was transformative in a way she probably hadn't anticipated. She encountered Islamic architecture and decorative arts for the first time and found herself deeply, lastingly fascinated. She bought objects, she studied. She began what would become a 50-year project of collecting that eventually produced one of the most significant private collections of Islamic art in the United States. Their last stop was Honolulu, Hawaii, where Doris built a winter home she named Shangri-La, inspired by the mythical paradise in James Hilton's 1933 novel. She designed it herself, incorporating Islamic architectural elements alongside Hawaiian ones, and filled it from the beginning with the art she had been gathering since the start of the honeymoon. It was the most personal house she would ever build, and it remained her refuge for the rest of her life. Back in the United States, Cromwell began his political push. He ran for the U.S. Senate from New Jersey in 1940 as a Democrat, against the Republican incumbent William Warren Barber. He lost, receiving around 44% of the vote to Barber's 55. Before the Senate race, he had served for 142 days as the United States Minister to Canada, appointed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in January 1940. but resigned after 5 months to enter the Senate contest, a decision that suggested his ambitions outran his patience. Doris had tried to help his political career. She accompanied him to campaign events, attended the required functions, and was present for the public performance of the partnership. But the press, when they showed up, came for her. The coverage would turn to the richest girl in the world rather than to the candidate her money was supporting, and this pattern, repeated enough times, wore on both of them, though probably for different reasons. She was exhausted by the attention. He was frustrated that her presence overshadowed rather than elevated him. While Cromwell was serving in Canada, Doris went back to Hawaii. They were living separately for extended stretches, and what filled that space on both sides was the subject of considerable gossip. There were persistent rumors about Doris's personal life during this period, and when she became pregnant in 1940, questions circulated about the identity of the father. Historical research, including analysis of telegrams and phone records from the period, has suggested that the biological father may have been Alec Cunningham Reid, a British politician with whom Doris had been involved. Cromwell accepted legal paternity. The baby, a girl named Arden, was born prematurely in Honolulu on July 11th, 1940. She lived one day. Doris was told she would never be able to have other children. She mourned Arden for the rest of her life, quietly, in the way she mourned most things, without making it visible to the world. She consulted psychics in an attempt to feel some connection to her daughter. Decades later, when she met a young woman and felt an inexplicable maternal pull toward her, the loss of Arden would be one of the ways she made sense of that connection. The marriage to Cromwell did not recover from the combination of distance, political failure, and grief. They divorced on December 21st, 1943. The settlement was generous, as Doris's settlements tended to be. Cromwell remarried eventually and ran unsuccessfully for Senate again in 1946 and lived until 1990, dying at 93 years old. He outlived Doris by 3 years. She was 30 years old when she filed for divorce. She had already spent years funding a man whose primary interest in her was financial. She had lost a child. She had learned what it felt like to be a public figure in someone else's political drama. She was about to meet someone very different from James Cromwell, and that meeting would produce the most spectacular and the shortest marriage of her life. The second marriage, Porfirio Rubirosa. During World War II, Doris Duke worked as a volunteer for the US Navy in a canteen in Egypt. She took a salary of $1 a year. For a woman who had been born into near incomprehensible wealth and spent most of her life being managed and observed and handled, there was something clarifying about actual work. Physical, purposeful, unglamorous. She found it, by multiple accounts, genuinely satisfying. After the war, she became a foreign correspondent for the International News Service and later wrote for Harper's Bazaar in Paris. It was in Rome in 1945, while working as a journalist, that she encountered Porfirio Rubirosa. Rubirosa was, by any serious accounting, one of the most extraordinary figures of the mid-20th century social world, and that description covers a lot of ground. He was born in 1909 in San Francisco de Macorís, in the Dominican Republic, the son of a man who rose from militia general to Dominican diplomat in Paris. Rubirosa grew up in France, returned to the Dominican Republic at 17, enrolled in law school, then abandoned it for the military. In 1931, he met the dictator Rafael Trujillo at a polo game, and that meeting defined the next 30 years of his life. Trujillo made him a lieutenant of the Presidential Guard. Rubirosa married Trujillo's eldest daughter, Flor de Oro, 2 years later. a union that secured his position within the regime and launched him into diplomatic service. He was stationed at embassies in Berlin, Paris, Vichy, Buenos Aires, Rome, Havana, and Brussels over the following decades. But diplomacy was always secondary to the life he actually lived. Racing cars competitively, playing polo at an elite level with his own team, moving through the most glamorous circles of post-war Europe and New York, with an ease that suggested he had been born to it. And then there were the women. Rubirosa's reputation with the opposite sex was, even accounting for exaggeration and the gossip culture of his milieu, genuinely extraordinary. His name became shorthand in certain Parisian restaurants for something that French waiters describe with a knowing reference that has made the phrase last decades past his death. He was charming in a way that multiple people across multiple decades consistently described as something close to chemical, a quality that defied ordinary explanation and that clearly operated on people in person far more powerfully than it does on paper. When Doris met him in Rome, Rubirosa was still married to his second wife, Danielle Darieux, the celebrated French actress. Doris, by some accounts, paid Darieux $1 million to agree to an uncontested divorce. Darieux and Rubirosa divorced in May 1947. Doris and Rubirosa married in Paris on September 1st, 1947. The US State Department took immediate notice. Duke's fortune was so substantial, and Rubirosa's connection to the Trujillo regime so direct, that officials formally cautioned her against using her money in ways that could give a foreign government political leverage. The concern, stated plainly, was that if Doris Duke died while married to a Trujillo agent, the fortune could flow in directions that were not in the national interest. Rubirosa was required to sign a prenuptial agreement. During the marriage itself, Doris gave Rubirosa an amount that, by various estimates, ran into several $1 million, including a stable of polo ponies, multiple sports cars, and a converted B-25 bomber he named Laganza, which he crashed within a year of receiving it. That summer of 1948, Doris discovered him in the company of his first ex-wife, Flor de Oro. She served him with divorce papers shortly afterward. The divorce was finalized in October 1948, 14 months after the wedding. In the settlement, Rubirosa received a $25,000 annual income for life or until he remarried, the 17th-century Paris house on Rue de Bellechasse, and a fishing fleet off the coast of Africa. Rubirosa went on to marry Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, known at the time as the poor little rich girl for the relentless misfortunes of her personal life, in December 1953. That marriage lasted 53 days. Hutton's settlement with Rubirosa reportedly included $2.5 million in cash, a coffee plantation in the Dominican Republic, and another converted B-25 bomber. He died in Paris on July 5, 1965, in a car accident after an all-night celebration following a polo victory. He was 56 years old. Doris Duke never married again after Rubirosa. She had been married twice, once to a man who needed her money, and once to a man who arguably needed it even more. Whatever she was looking for in those marriages, she had not found it. And by the early 1950s, she seemed to have reached a kind of private conclusion. The marriages had been experiments that had failed, and she was going to stop running the experiment. What she turned to instead was the work. And the life she built in the decades that followed was, in many ways, more interesting than anything her marriages had produced. But before we get to those years, there is a night in 1966 that cannot be skipped over. Because what happened at Rough Point on the evening of October 7th has never been fully resolved, and it sits at the center of Doris Duke's story like a stone that no one has ever managed to move. The Night at Rough Point. Rough Point in October is a different place from the summer estate of the postcard photographs. The season winds down, the crowds thin, and the mansion on Bellevue Avenue, 115 rooms, set above the sea, enormous and sombre even in full daylight, takes on a particular quality in the October dusk. It is the kind of house that feels, at that time of year, like it has its own gravity. On the evening of October 7th, 1966, Doris Duke and Eduardo Tirella were preparing to leave Rough Point together. They were going out to look at an antique, by most accounts, an ordinary errand of the kind that constituted a large part of their working relationship. Doris was 53 years old. Tirella was 42. He had known her for a decade. He was an Italian-American designer, art curator and consultant, a man of genuine aesthetic sensitivity who had spent years helping Doris manage, arrange, and acquire objects for several of her properties. He had a background that was broader than his professional title suggested. He was a decorated veteran, a former performer, and by the time of his death was beginning to establish himself as a set designer in Hollywood. He was friends with Sharon Tate, Richard Burton, and others in the film world. His career was, at that moment, on the verge of something. He had also, it appears, told Doris Duke that he was leaving, that after a decade in her orbit, he was going to Hollywood to build something of his own. Tirella was driving. The vehicle was a rented 1966 Dodge Polara station wagon. When they reached the massive wrought-iron gates at the front of the estate, Tirella got out of the car to open them, as would have been the natural thing to do. At that moment, Doris slid over to the driver's seat. What happened next is where the story fractures. The car accelerated. Tirella was struck. The vehicle dragged him across Bellevue Avenue and pinned him against a tree. He was killed instantly, from what the autopsy later described as fractures of the skull, ribs on the right side of the chest, and massive internal injuries. Doris Duke told police, when they interviewed her several days later, not at the scene, not immediately, but days later, that the car had suddenly leaped forward, and she had found herself on top of him. The Newport police chief at the time, Joseph A. Radice, declared the death an unfortunate accident within roughly 96 hours of it occurring, based essentially on Duke's own account. No inquest was held. The investigation ran to only a few pages of documentation. No charges were filed. Newport, in 1966, was a city that understood its relationship to the wealthy families who summered along Bellevue Avenue. The Duke name had been there since the 1890s. The decision to close the case quickly, without the kind of investigation that the death of a person under a motor vehicle normally requires, was noted at the time, including by officers who were on the scene and who, in later years, expressed their own discomfort with how the case had been handled. Tirella's family filed a civil lawsuit in 1967. The case went through the courts for years. Duke was eventually found negligent in the civil proceeding and ordered to pay. The Tirella family, 8 siblings in total, received $5,620 each after legal fees. This from a woman whose fortune was generating roughly $1 million a week in interest. Shortly after Tirella's death, Doris donated $25,000 to restore Newport's famous Cliff Walk and $10,000 to the local hospital that had treated her following the incident. The donations were made within days of the accident. The case never entirely went away. In 2020 and 2021, investigative journalist Peter Lance published a detailed examination of the death, including a fabricated police transcript he uncovered in which Newport's police chief reportedly asked Duke's attorney to provide something that would allow the case to be closed, and her attorney reportedly suggested the police write something up that Duke would then sign. Newport Police briefly reopened a review in 2021 following the emergence of a new witness, a man who had been a 13-year-old paperboy on Bellevue Avenue that evening and who described what he had seen and heard. The review concluded without changing the official finding. As of today, Eduardo Tirella's death remains officially classified as an accident. The years that followed for Doris Duke were, on the surface, defined by extraordinary creativity and philanthropic generosity. But running underneath everything was a woman who had grown increasingly isolated and who was, in her final decade, surrounded by people whose motivations were not always what they appeared to be. The life she built. In the decades between her second divorce and her final years, Doris Duke built something remarkable. A life that was genuinely her own, shaped by her own curiosity and her own standards, answerable to almost no one. Shangri-La in Honolulu continued to grow as a collection. Over 50 years, she acquired approximately 3,500 objects representing Islamic and Southeast Asian decorative arts. Tiles from Iran, carved plasterwork from Syria, metalwork from Egypt, textiles from across the Muslim world. She chose based on her own developing expertise, rather than simply deferring to dealers. She had been studying seriously since her first honeymoon trip in the mid-1930s, and by the later decades of her collecting life, she was operating at a level that scholars and curators took seriously. The house is now open to the public as the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art, and it remains one of the most significant collections of its kind anywhere in the United States. At Duke Farms in New Jersey, she built Duke Gardens, 60,000 square feet of enclosed botanical display spread across 11 interconnected greenhouse environments, each a full-scale recreation of a distinct garden tradition from around the world. She began the project in 1958, worked on it for years with a focus that her staff described as consuming, sometimes putting in 16-hour days. She opened it to the public. Hundreds of thousands of visitors came. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the most ambitious horticultural projects in American history, undertaken entirely with her own money and largely by her own design. She was a serious jazz pianist. She had studied from an early age and continued her education throughout her life, taking lessons from Hall Overton, a jazz composer and teacher who worked with some of the most important musicians of the era. She was also committed to the jazz world as a patron. She was one of the small group of people who helped found the Newport Jazz Festival, which became the first major platform for African American jazz musicians to reach a primarily white, upper-class audience. This was in 1954, before the civil rights movement had produced the cultural shifts that would later make such integration seem less remarkable. At the time, it was a genuine act. She preserved more than 80 historic buildings in Newport, Rhode Island, through the Newport Restoration Foundation she established in 1968. She appointed Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, a close friend in her later years, as the vice president of the foundation. The buildings she saved still stand. She studied modern dance with Martha Graham. She learned tap from Bill Bojangles Robinson. She sang in a black gospel choir on weekends, by choice, not performance. She simply loved the music and went where the music was. Throughout all of this, she gave away money, enormous amounts of it, much of it anonymously. It is estimated that she distributed more than $400 million in charitable contributions during her lifetime. She funded HIV and AIDS research in the early 1980s, when doing so was genuinely controversial, and when most institutions were still treating the epidemic as someone else's problem. She quietly purchased pipe organs for thousands of small churches across the United States. She supported family planning, child welfare, wildlife conservation, and Native American communities. often without anyone knowing she was the source. None of this produced the happiness or the peace that might seem to follow naturally from a life of extraordinary purpose and generosity. In her personal life, she remained deeply mistrustful of people's motives. Her father's dying words had lodged in her and never quite left. She could be warm and she could be cold, and the people around her were never entirely sure which they were going to encounter. She was generous to those she trusted and capable of enormous cruelty to those she felt had betrayed her. The boundary between the two categories shifted, and the shifting was not always predictable. In 1985, she met a young woman named Chandi Hefner, a Hare Krishna devotee who was 32 years old. Doris was 72. She felt, by her own account, a connection to Hefner that she struggled to explain in ordinary terms. Hefner had told Doris, at some point, that she believed she was the reincarnation of Doris's daughter, the baby, Arden, who had lived only one day back in 1940. Doris, who had spent decades consulting psychics and exploring questions about what lay beyond ordinary experience, found this deeply resonant. In 1988, Doris Duke legally adopted Chandi Hefner, then 35 years old. Duke was 75. 2 years later, in 1990, she disinherited Hefner and moved to reverse the adoption. The reversal process was still incomplete when Doris died. It did not prevent Hefner from mounting a substantial legal challenge to the estate afterward, claiming entitlement as the legally adopted daughter. That challenge was eventually settled. It was Chandi Hefner who introduced Bernard Lafferty into the Duke household. And that is where the final chapter begins. What happened in the last years of Doris Duke's life, who was making decisions, who had access, and exactly what occurred in her final hours, is a story that the courts spent years trying to untangle and never fully managed to. Bernard Lafferty and the final years. Bernard Lafferty was born in Creeslow, County Donegal, Ireland. He was orphaned by 17 and eventually made his way to the United States, where he found work in domestic service. He worked as a butler for the singer Peggy Lee before he came to Doris Duke's household in 1987, hired initially as part of the regular staff. He was, by multiple accounts, a man of limited formal education, a complicated relationship with alcohol that swung between sobriety and serious excess, and a genuine gift for being present and attentive in the way that people who are lonely often find more valuable than any conventional credential. He wore his hair in a ponytail. He walked through Duke's estates barefoot while still maintaining the formal elements of the butler's role, an unusual combination that somehow worked, at least for Doris. He was also gay, which in the world of Doris Duke's household was simply a fact, without particular social weight. By 1990, when Doris became ill in Hawaii and grew convinced, partly through Lafferty's influence, that Chandi Hefner and her boyfriend were working against her, Duke returned to Beverly Hills with Lafferty as her primary companion. The circle around her contracted. The estate attorney who had worked with her for years, Erwin Bloom, was effectively removed from her affairs. New legal arrangements were made. 6 months before she died, Doris Duke rewrote her will to make Lafferty the executor of her entire estate and a central figure in the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, which was to receive the vast bulk of her $1.2 billion fortune. He was also given a lifetime annuity of $500,000 per year. Duke died on October 28, 1993, at her home in Beverly Hills, at the former estate of Rudolph Valentino, known as Falcon Lair. She was 80 years old. The official cause of death was progressive pulmonary edema leading to cardiac arrest, following complications from a stroke she had suffered in July and knee replacement surgeries earlier that year. The will was contested almost immediately. Lafferty had, in the months since Duke's death, bought a $2.5 million mansion in Bel Air, and spent estate money with a freedom that alarmed those overseeing the process. The lawyers challenging the will, representing Chandy Hefner, three former Duke servants, and others, produced as their central evidence an affidavit from one of Doris's deathbed nurses, Tammy Payette. Payette stated that in the period before Duke lost consciousness for the final time, she had witnessed Lafferty administering quantities of morphine and Demerol that far exceeded what had been prescribed. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office investigated. The investigation was substantive enough to receive significant public attention, and at least one official spoke publicly about the seriousness of the questions being raised. In July 1996, the office announced that there was no credible evidence to support a homicide charge. No prosecution followed. Payette herself was later convicted of stealing from her patients and served time in prison, which undermined the weight of her testimony in public perception, though her account was never definitively disproven. The legal battles over the will consumed years. At their height, approximately 40 lawyers were involved, and the process had generated an estimated $10 million in legal fees, none of which went to the charitable causes the will was supposed to serve. In May 1996, Lafferty agreed to step down as executor in exchange for the $4.5 million in executor's fees he had already received, plus the $500,000 annual income he was to keep for life. He did not keep it for long. On November 4th, 1996, barely 3 years after Doris Duke died, Bernard Lafferty was found dead in his bed at his Bel Air home. He was 51 years old. There was no sign of violence. Coroner's officials confirmed no foul play. He died of a heart attack, his health having deteriorated significantly under the combined weight of alcohol, sedentary living, and the stress of years of litigation. The $500,000 annual income died with him. His ashes were scattered off Hawaii, the same place, in the same waters, where he had scattered Doris Duke's ashes 3 years before. What she left behind. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation eventually found its footing. With the legal turbulence resolved, the foundation began distributing the fortune it had been created to distribute. Over the decades since her death, it has given away hundreds of millions of dollars to causes in the arts, environmental conservation, medical research, child welfare, and wildlife protection. Duke Farms in New Jersey became a nature preserve and environmental education center, open to the public. Shangri-La in Honolulu became a museum. The Newport Restoration Foundation she created continues its work preserving the historic architecture of Rhode Island. Duke University, which carries her family's name, grew into one of the great research universities in the world, though for many years Doris herself was largely absent from the university's commemorations of its own history. There are no marble busts of her among the institutional portraiture of the Duke family's male founders, despite the fact that she was both a direct descendant and a significant benefactor. Her authorized biography, written by Sally Bingham and published years after her death, worked to reconstruct the life of a woman who had spent 50 years actively resisting documentation. She rarely wrote letters. She refused most interviews. She wanted, with an intensity that was itself a kind of statement, not to be known in the way the public had always wanted to know her. The press had called her the richest little girl in the world when she was 12. They had followed her through her marriages, her divorces, the death at Rough Point, the adoption of Chandy Hefner, the rise of Bernard Lafferty. At every turn, the coverage had been more interested in the spectacle than in the person. Doris Duke was, underneath the spectacle, a woman who had built extraordinary things, collections that scholars still study, gardens that hundreds of thousands of people experienced, a concert series that changed American musical culture, a preservation foundation that saved irreplaceable buildings. She gave away nearly $500 million, most of it without her name attached. She was also a woman who never quite shook the piece of advice her father had left her at 12. Trust no one. The marriages both failed, in different ways, because of versions of the same problem. Men who were more interested in what she had than in who she was. And the final chapter of her life unfolded in circumstances that suggested the warning had not protected her as well as her father had hoped. What is left, at the end of all of it, is something genuinely ambiguous. A life of real accomplishment, real generosity, and real loneliness. A fortune that survived her in the form of institutions that continue to do good work. And a set of questions about Rough Point in 1966, about the final months in Beverly Hills, that have never received the full accounting they probably deserve. Doris Duke was born into a name she hadn't earned and spent 80 years trying to figure out whether that name was a gift or a sentence. In the end, it was probably both. She built things that last. She gave money to causes that the rest of the world was slow to care about. She loved jazz and Islamic art and gospel music and camels. She kept camels at Rough Point, which the local children on the cliff walk talked about for years, and she refused, for most of her adult life, to be entirely what anyone expected her to be. She never found the marriage that worked. She never fully escaped the public eye that had found her before she could speak. And she died in circumstances that her own extraordinary intelligence, had she been well enough to observe them clearly, she would almost certainly have recognized as exactly the kind of situation her father had tried to warn her about from his deathbed. The fortune is still out there, working in the world in ways she designed but did not live to see fully realized. The gardens, the collection, the 80 buildings in Newport whose walls she paid to preserve, the jazz festival that changed who got to be heard in America, the AIDS research that helped when almost no one else was willing to. And somewhere in all of it, in the music and the Islamic tilework and the long greenhouse paths of Duke Farms, is a woman who spent a lifetime being seen by the entire world and known by almost no one. She asked for very little in the end, and she gave away more than most people will ever possess. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. There is a wedding photograph from November 1895 that looks, on the surface, like every Gilded Age fantasy come to life. The bride is 18, dressed in an impossibly beautiful gown, surrounded by the cream of New York society. And she is crying as she walks down the aisle. Not quiet tears, visible, inconsolable weeping that no amount of composure training could contain. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt, and the story of how she ended up at that altar, against her will, locked into a marriage she had begged to escape, is one of the most extraordinary stories the Gilded Age produced. The world that made her. To understand what happened to Consuelo Vanderbilt, you have to start with the world she was born into, because that world had very specific ideas about what a girl like her was for. She was born on March 2nd, 1877, in New York City, the only daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife, Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt. The Vanderbilt fortune, by 1877, was one of the largest private accumulations of wealth in American history, built by her great-grandfather Cornelius Vanderbilt through shipping and railroads in the decades following the Civil War. William Kissam was Cornelius's grandson, and while the family's wealth had been distributed across multiple heirs and had contracted somewhat from its peak, the Vanderbilt name still carried a weight that opened every door in American society, and many doors in Europe as well. Alva Vanderbilt was not a Vanderbilt by birth. She was Alva Smith, the daughter of a Southern cotton merchant who had lost most of his money by the time she was an adolescent. She had married William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875 with the full understanding that she was marrying into a world of almost incomprehensible wealth, and she had set about conquering that world with a ferocity and strategic intelligence that made her, by the late 1880s, one of the most powerful social figures in New York. She had built the family's mansion at 665th Avenue, a limestone chateau that was considered one of the great architectural statements of the Gilded Age. She had thrown the ball of 1883, an event so lavish and so carefully orchestrated that it had effectively forced open the doors of old New York society, which had previously looked down on the Vanderbilts as new money. She had built Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island, another chateau, commissioned specifically to outdo every other summer cottage on Bellevue Avenue. Alva was, in short, a woman of extraordinary ambition, genuine intelligence, and very little interest in the preferences of anyone who stood between her and what she wanted, including her own daughter. Consuelo was raised in the shadow of all this, with a combination of privilege and restriction that would have produced anxiety in almost any child. She had tutors, governesses, dancing masters, and language instructors. She was educated in French, Italian, German, and English literature. She was taught how to sit, stand, walk, and enter a room. She was given every advantage that money and social position could provide, and almost none of the ordinary childhood freedoms that children with far less than she had were permitted to take for granted. She was not allowed to choose her own friends. She was not allowed to read what she wanted. She was not permitted to express opinions that contradicted her mother's preferences. The rod Oliver Vanderbilt used to enforce her rules was not physical. It was psychological, and it was absolute. Consuelo later described her mother as someone whose love was real, but whose expression of that love was indistinguishable from the inside, from control. She adored her mother and feared her simultaneously. She had no frame of reference for what a relationship with a parent might look like that did not contain both those things at once. That combination, love and fear, loyalty and terror, was the foundation on which everything that followed was built. As she grew older, Consuelo became aware that she was beautiful in a way that attracted significant attention. She was tall, slender, dark-haired, with a bearing that combined natural elegance with the years of deportment training that had been imposed on her. She was also, by the time she approached adulthood, recognized as one of the great heiresses of her generation. Her fortune, at the time of her debut, was estimated at approximately $20 million, a sum that, in today's money, would represent something close to $4 billion. That figure was not private. It was widely known, widely discussed, and widely understood, on both sides of the Atlantic, to be the central fact of Consuelo Vanderbilt's life. It was also, as one observer noted at the time, a kind of prison. The money was not hers in any practical sense. She could not spend it, invest it, or give it away without her mother's involvement. What it did, instead, was define her. It made her a commodity, whether anyone used that word or not. And her mother, who understood commodities and their proper use better than almost anyone in New York, had already decided what this particular commodity was for. Alva Vanderbilt had been planning her daughter's future for years before Consuelo was old enough to form an opinion about it. And by the time Consuelo did form an opinion, a very strong one, about a very specific young man, the machinery was already in motion. The man she loved and the man she was given. In the early 1890s, Consuelo Vanderbilt fell in love. The object of her affection was Winthrop Rutherford, a tall, handsome, impeccably pedigreed New Yorker who moved in the same elevated circles as the Vanderbilts and who was, by virtually every conventional measure, an excellent prospect. He was wealthy, well-born, well-connected, and he was genuinely in love with Consuelo. They were, in the vocabulary of their social world, a perfectly natural match. Alva found out and immediately moved to end it. Her objections to Rutherford were not financial. He had money. They were not social. He had the right family. They were, by any ordinary logic, difficult to articulate. But Alva was not operating by ordinary logic. She had decided, years earlier, that her daughter was not going to marry an American. She was going to marry a title. Specifically, she was going to marry into the British aristocracy, which Alva regarded as the highest rung of the social ladder available to a woman of Consuelo's position. An American husband, however eligible, was not part of the plan. Alva moved with characteristic efficiency. She intercepted Consuelo's correspondence with Rutherford. She refused to allow him into the house. She swept Consuelo off to Europe, partly to remove her from Rutherford's proximity, and partly to begin the process of introducing her to the eligible European aristocracy. When Rutherford followed them to Europe, a measure of how seriously he took the relationship, Consuelo was forbidden to see him. Alva then deployed the kind of psychological pressure that she had been perfecting for years. She told Consuelo that there was a history of mental illness in the Rutherford family, a claim that was not true, but that was delivered with such conviction that a young woman who had been raised to trust her mother's judgment entirely could not easily dismiss it. She told Consuelo that Rutherford was incapable of having children. She warned of other vague catastrophes that would follow if Consuelo pursued him. And then, when none of that was sufficient, she escalated. She told Consuelo that she was experiencing heart trouble, that the stress of her daughter's disobedience was genuinely threatening her health. She suggested, not entirely implicitly, that if Consuelo did not comply, the consequences for her mother's survival were uncertain. She also, according to accounts that emerged later, threatened Rutherford himself, telling associates that she would have him removed from the picture by any means necessary if he did not withdraw from the relationship. This was not ambiguous. This was not a mother expressing reasonable parental concern. This was coercion, conducted by someone who had a lifetime of practice at getting what she wanted and who was willing to use whatever tools were available to her. Consuelo, who was 17 years old and who had been raised from infancy to defer to her mother's will in all things, did not have the resources to resist it. She ended the engagement with Rutherford. She later described the period that followed as one of genuine despair, crying herself to sleep, unable to eat, unable to find any foothold of hope in a situation that felt, from the inside, like a closing trap. The man Alva had chosen was Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. He was known in his social circle as Sonny, a nickname that had nothing to do with his personality, which was cool, proud, and frequently disdainful, particularly toward anything he regarded as socially beneath him. He was 23 years old when he first visited Marble House, Alva's Newport estate, in the summer of 1895. He was also deeply in financial trouble. Blenheim Palace, the ancestral home of the Dukes of Marlborough in Woodstock, Oxfordshire, was one of the great architectural monuments of England. A Baroque masterpiece built in the early 18th century as a gift from the nation to John Churchill, the first Duke, following his victory at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. It was also, by the 1890s, in serious disrepair. The cost of maintaining a building of that scale, on the income available to the family, had become a crisis. The 9th Duke needed money, a very large amount of it, quickly, or Blenheim would continue to deteriorate beyond the point of recovery. The solution, in the economy of the Gilded Age aristocracy, was obvious. You married an American heiress. Alva invited Marlborough to Marble House. She organized entertainments around him. She arranged for Consuelo to be in his company constantly. When the moment came, Marlborough proposed to Consuelo in the Gothic room at Marble House. He was not romantic about it. He was businesslike. Consuelo accepted because she had, at this point, been told that she had no other choice. She wept when she told her younger brothers the news. The tears were not the kind that accompanied joy. The marriage settlement was negotiated between Alva, William Kissam Vanderbilt, and the Duke's representatives. The terms were, in their fashion, staggering. The Vanderbilt family agreed to deliver approximately $2.5 million in Beech Creek Railroad stock, a sum equivalent to somewhere around $75 million in today's money, plus an annual income of $100,000 for the Duke and Duchess jointly. In exchange, Consuelo would receive the title of Duchess of Marlborough and the privilege of spending the rest of her life in a country she had not chosen, in a house she had not chosen, beside a man who had not chosen her for any reason other than what she was worth on paper. The wedding was set for November 6th, 1895, and on the morning of that day, something happened inside the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue that told the whole story, even though most of the world would not know about it for years. The wedding and the honeymoon. On the morning of November 6th, 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt was locked in her room. She had spent the previous night in a state of profound distress, and when morning came, she was not in any condition to be dressed and presented to the Society of New York as a radiant bride. Alva managed this in the way she managed everything, with firm efficiency. Consuelo was not permitted to delay. She was dressed, her hair was arranged, and she was placed in the carriage that would take her to St. Thomas's Church on Fifth Avenue, where over 2,000 guests were waiting. 300 police officers had been deployed outside the church to manage the crowds. Thousands of onlookers had gathered in the street to watch the carriage arrive. Mostly women, by most accounts. Women who had followed the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt in the newspapers and who had constructed, out of the available material, a fairy tale. The newspapers had been covering the engagement for months. The trousseau alone had been estimated at £10,000. The scale of the occasion, the flowers, the music, the guest list, the gown, communicated fairy tale with absolute conviction. Inside the church, the people who were close enough to see, clearly, could see something else. The bride was crying as she walked down the aisle, not dabbing at elegant tears, but genuinely, visibly weeping. The kind of crying that a person does when something irreversible is happening and there is nothing left to do about it. Several guests noted it. Some assumed it was emotion. Others understood it as something closer to grief. The ceremony concluded. The Duke of Marlborough, ninth of his line, married Consuelo Vanderbilt, heiress to the greatest American fortune of the Gilded Age. They departed for their honeymoon, which took them first to Blenheim Palace and then across Europe. What happened on that honeymoon entered the record later, through Consuelo's own memoir and through the accounts of people who knew the couple in those early years. The Duke, at some point during the trip, turned to his new wife and told her the truth. The plain, unadorned, honest truth that no amount of social convention could make acceptable. He told her that he had been in love with another woman, an English woman, and that he had given her up in order to marry Consuelo and save Blenheim. He told her that the marriage was not about her, it was about the palace. He also told her, with the particular disdain that characterized his dealings with most things he considered beneath him, that he had no regard for anything that was not British. He was not cruel about it in the explosive sense. He was cold. He said it, as a matter of fact, in the way that a person who has never had to consider another person's feelings at any length tends to state things. And then he went back to reading his congratulatory correspondence, including a letter from Queen Victoria herself, which he appeared to find considerably more interesting than his wife. Consuelo absorbed this information on her honeymoon and continued. She had been absorbing things she had not chosen and continuing anyway for her entire life. This was not different in kind, only in scale. They arrived at Blenheim Palace in the autumn of 1895. It was enormous, cold, draughty, and staffed by servants who had served the Spencer-Churchill family for generations and who were not, at first, entirely sure what to make of an American duchess. The palace had 187 rooms, most of them arranged in the kind of formal grandeur that prioritized appearance over warmth in every sense of the word. Consuelo was assigned her apartments. She was introduced to the social and ceremonial obligations of a duchess. She was told by the Dowager Duchess of Marlborough that her first and most important duty was to produce a son, and that it was imperative it be a son, because the alternative was too grim to contemplate. The alternative, in the Dowager's framing, was that the dukedom would eventually pass to Winston Churchill, Marlborough's cousin, and a man whom the Dowager regarded with little warmth. Consuelo did not reply. She was 18 years old, and she had just been told, in the plainest possible terms, what she was for. In the years that followed, she became one of the most beloved duchesses England had ever seen, loved by the people on the Blenheim estate, admired by the royal family, admired by the press. And the Duke remained cold, and the marriage remained a transaction. What happened inside those walls, behind the public display, is one of the quieter tragedies of the Gilded Age. Life at Blenheim. The life of the Duchess of Marlborough was, from the outside, magnificent. Consuelo was presented at court. She attended the Duchess of Devonshire's famous fancy dress ball in 1897. She was at Queen Victoria's funeral in 1901. She carried one of the canopies at the coronation of King Edward VII in 1902 and sat in one of the most prominent positions in Westminster Abbey that any non-royal woman could occupy. She travelled to South Africa, to India, to the great houses of England, and to the royal residences that the Marlboroughs were entitled to visit. She dazzled everyone she met. The Prince of Wales was charmed. Society journalists wrote about her with the kind of warm reverence reserved for figures who seem to embody everything their age imagines itself to be. She also bore 2 sons. John Albert William Spencer Churchill, Marquess of Blandford, was born in September 1897. Lord Ivor Spencer Churchill was born in October 1898. Both boys were healthy. The Duke had his heir and his spare. The Dowager Duchess had what she had demanded. Consuelo had fulfilled the primary function for which she had been installed. What she had not been given, in return, was anything resembling a marriage. The Duke was a difficult man to live with on every level. He was proud to the point of rigidity, cold in the particular way that English aristocratic upbringing produced, and entirely lacking in the kind of warmth or curiosity that would have made him capable of genuine intimacy with anyone. He and Consuelo had nothing in common beyond their sons and their shared obligation to keep the palace running. They disagreed about how to manage the estate. They disagreed about their social obligations. They disagreed, in the private sphere, about almost everything. Within a few years of the wedding, they were living separately within Blenheim itself, occupying their own apartments, conducting their own social lives, and maintaining the public appearance of a marriage in the way that their position required, while privately understanding that the marriage was a performance and nothing more. The Duke had not entirely abandoned the woman he had given up to marry Consuelo. Gladys Marie Deacon, an American-born beauty of extraordinary intelligence whom the Duke had known for years, remained a presence in his life. At first through correspondence and occasional social meetings, and eventually as the marriage to Consuelo deteriorated beyond any pretense of intimacy, more openly. Marcel Proust, who knew Gladys Deacon well, described her as one of the most beautiful and intelligent women he had ever met. The Duke shared that view. He had not hidden it from Consuelo, and Consuelo, living in her cold apartments at Blenheim, knew about Gladys and understood that whatever the Duke had told her on their honeymoon about the woman he had given up had not remained entirely true. Consuelo responded to the misery of her marriage in the only ways available to her. She threw herself into the life of the estate, visiting the workers' cottages and cottagers' homes on the Blenheim grounds, running charitable initiatives for the families who worked the land, involving herself in the social welfare of the local community, in ways that were unusual for a duchess of her generation, and that made her genuinely loved by the people who depended on the estate. She was remembered for decades afterward by families on the Blenheim estate as someone who came to their doors and sat with them and was actually present, not performing charity from a safe distance, but doing it in the way that someone does when they mean it. She also became involved in public life in ways that exceeded the usual charitable activities of a society duchess. She was a member of the Women's Liberal Federation, interested in the political questions of her day, and increasingly committed to the causes of education and social welfare that would occupy her more fully after the marriage ended. She advocated for working women. She paid attention to legislation that affected the poor. These were not fashionable positions. They were genuine ones. During the London season, she managed the great Marlborough townhouse that her father's money had built, Sunderland House on Curzon Street in Mayfair. She hosted dinners and balls and political gatherings at a level that required the management of a large staff and a complex social calendar. She did it flawlessly, and she went home to a husband who regarded her, if he regarded her at all, as a useful piece of the aristocratic furniture. It is worth pausing on the money for a moment, because the money was the thing that made all of this possible, and the thing that made it impossible to leave. The $100,000 annual income was structured so that it was technically available to the Duke and Duchess jointly, which in practical terms meant that the Duke controlled it. The railroad stock settlement had gone directly to stabilizing the Blenheim finances. Consuelo had brought an enormous fortune into the marriage, and had, in the way of married women's property law as it operated in that era, relatively limited individual claim to it once the marriage was established. She was not penniless, but she was not free in the way that someone with truly independent means could be free. The formal separation came in 1906, 11 years into the marriage. It was not announced with any drama. It was simply understood, in the circles they moved in, that the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough were no longer living as husband and wife, and that this state of affairs was permanent. They remained technically married for another 15 years. The divorce was not finalized until 1921. By the time the separation became official, Consuelo had already found something that Blenheim had never given her. And the story of how the marriage finally ended, and who testified to make it possible, is one of the more remarkable moments in the whole remarkable story. The separation, the divorce, and what her mother confessed. The years between the formal separation in 1906 and the divorce in 1921 were not idle ones for Consuelo. She moved back to London, taking apartments and continuing the charitable and political work that had become the centre of her waking life. She worked with the Women's Liberal Federation and with various organisations focused on the welfare of working-class women and children. She was appointed a member of the London County Council's Education Committee. She sat on committees and attended hearings and took notes and pushed for policies that would have been entirely foreign to the world that had produced her. She also, during this period, found the kind of intellectual and emotional companionship that her marriage had never contained. The French aviator and textile heir, Jacques Balsan, had been part of her social world for years. He was a man of genuine charm, broad interests, and a temperament that was the near opposite of Marlborough's cold hauteur. He had first encountered Consuelo at her debutante season, years before the marriage to the Duke, and by multiple accounts had been in love with her from that early meeting. The relationship between them deepened during the years after the separation in ways that were necessarily discreet, given that Consuelo was still legally married to Marlborough. The Duke, meanwhile, was pursuing his own separate life. His long attachment to Gladys Deacon had continued through and beyond the separation, and by the time the divorce proceedings were underway, it was well understood that Gladys was the woman he intended to marry as soon as the law permitted. The divorce was finalized on July 4th, 1921, American Independence Day, a coincidence that several observers found darkly appropriate. On the same day, Consuelo married Jacques Balsan in a civil ceremony. She was 44 years old. The marriage to the Duke had lasted 25 years, most of them spent either in open misery or in the kind of managed distance that passes for civility among people with strong reasons to avoid outright hostility. The annulment came 5 years later, in 1926. It was initiated by the Duke, who had converted to Roman Catholicism, or was in the process of considering it, and who needed the Catholic Church's formal recognition that his first marriage had not been a valid sacrament. The grounds available under canon law for such an annulment were limited. The only truly reliable one was the absence of free consent, the claim that one or both parties had entered the marriage under duress. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, who had by this point spent years as one of the most prominent figures in the American suffragist movement, advocating forcefully for women's rights and autonomy, appeared before the church tribunal and gave testimony. She stated, without apparent hesitation or embarrassment, that she had forced her daughter to marry the Duke of Marlborough. She had always had absolute power over her daughter, she said. She had issued an order. Nobody discussed it. She had not begged. She had commanded. The annulment was granted on August 19th, 1926. The ninth Duke married Gladys Deacon later that year. The marriage to Gladys lasted only a few years before deteriorating into the same cold, separate existence that had characterized his first marriage, though without the Vanderbilt money to keep it structured. He eventually evicted Gladys from Blenheim. She lived the rest of her life in increasingly impoverished and eccentric circumstances, a trajectory that was its own kind of commentary on what it meant to have been the woman the Duke of Marlborough had actually chosen. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont died in 1933, having made her peace with Consuelo in the years after the annulment. The two women, who had spent decades on opposite sides of a decision that had defined one of their lives, found their way to something warmer in the end. Consuelo described her mother, in later years, with a complexity that resisted simple resolution, as someone who had believed, however wrongly and however coercively, that she was acting in her daughter's best interest, and whose genuine love for Consuelo had always existed alongside the controlling ambition that had done so much damage. What came after 1921 was, at last, the life that Consuelo had never been permitted to have, and it was, by all accounts, everything that Blenheim had not been. The life she finally chose. The marriage to Jacques Balsan was the inverse of everything that had come before it. He was warm where Marlborough had been cold, curious where Marlborough had been disdainful, genuinely interested in the person Consuelo was, rather than the fortune she represented. They built a life together that had the texture of real happiness, a quality that had been so consistently absent from Consuelo's earlier existence that it must have felt, in the early years, almost surprising. They divided their time between Paris, the French Riviera, and a chateau called Saint-Georges Motel near Dreux in Normandy, which Consuelo renovated with the same care and attention she had brought to the public rooms at Blenheim. Winston Churchill, who was a cousin of the Duke of Marlborough and a friend of Consuelo's throughout her married years, was a frequent visitor at the chateau. He came to paint. Churchill was a passionate amateur painter. And to talk, and the warmth of those visits, described by people who were present for them, was a far cry from anything that had happened inside Blenheim Palace. Alva Vanderbilt, in one of the gestures of late-life reconciliation that characterized her relationship with her daughter after the annulment, bought a neighboring chateau in France in order to be near Consuelo. The two women, who had spent decades navigating the damage that Alva's ambitions had done, found a kind of proximity in their old age that they had never managed when it mattered most. Consuelo continued the charitable work that had defined the years at Blenheim, extending it into new areas. She and the Princesse de Polignac, Winneretta singer, heiress to the singer sewing machine fortune, worked together to build a large hospital in France, designed specifically for working-class patients, with 360 beds. She ran a play school for local children in Normandy. She built a sanitarium on the chateau grounds. The scale of this work was not the fashionable philanthropy of a society woman looking for something to fill her afternoons. It was serious, sustained, and practically focused, and it was the direct continuation of the work she had begun on the Blenheim estate 30 years earlier. When the German invasion of France began in 1940, the Balsans were evacuated through Spain and Portugal, eventually reaching the United States. They established a home at Casa Alva, a large property near Palm Beach, Florida, named after Consuelo's mother, an act of naming that said something quiet and real about the nature of their reconciliation. They also began summering in Southampton, New York, in a shingled house that became a gathering place for their circle of friends. Jacques Balsan died in 1956. He was 87 years old and had been married to Consuelo for 35 years. She was 78 when she lost him. After his death, she continued to divide her time between New York and Southampton, remaining a recognizable and much respected figure in both places. The woman in her 80s, who had once been the most famous bride in America and who was now simply herself, without any of the theatrical apparatus that had surrounded her for the first half of her life. She had published her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, in 1953. It was a restrained book by the standards of the story it told, not a settling of scores, not an indictment, but a careful and observant account of a life that had been, in its first chapter, genuinely extraordinary in its misery, and in its later chapters, genuinely extraordinary in other ways. She wrote about Blenheim with the distance of someone who had processed what it cost her and had moved on. She wrote about her mother with a complexity that resisted easy judgment. She wrote about Jacques with a quiet happiness that was entirely unlike anything else in the book. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan died on December 6, 1964, in Southampton, New York. She was 87 years old. In accordance with her wishes, she was buried in the churchyard of St. Martin's in Blaydon, Oxfordshire, the small village church that lies within sight of Blenheim Palace, where her son, the 10th Duke, and her grandson were buried, and where Winston Churchill himself would be buried the following year. She chose, in the end, to rest near the place that had represented so much unhappiness and near the people who had made it bearable. The 9th Duke, Charles Spencer Churchill, had died in 1934. His marriage to Gladys Deacon had effectively ended years before his death, and he died largely alone at Blenheim, surrounded by the rooms that Consuelo's money had restored, and that his own personality had long since emptied of warmth. Gladys lived on until 1977, in circumstances so reduced and peculiar that they read, in retrospect, as a kind of dark epilogue to the whole transaction. And Winthrop Rutherford, the man Consuelo had loved, the man Alva had worked so hard to remove from the picture, married twice, lived a long life, and died in 1944. Whether he and Consuelo were ever in contact again after the marriage to Marlborough is not something the record resolves. What the record does show is that Consuelo never forgot him. She mentioned him, with care, in her memoir. She described the love she had felt for him as real, and the loss of that relationship as one of the wounds that did not fully close. What the full story of Consuelo Vanderbilt's life shows, looked at whole, is something that belongs to a particular moment in history, but that is not, in any important sense, over. The Gilded Age produced dozens of these transactions. American heiresses shipped across the Atlantic to shore up the finances of crumbling English estates, their wealth exchanged for titles, their preferences treated as irrelevant details to be managed or overridden. Consuelo was the most famous of them, partly because the circumstances of her marriage were so extreme, and partly because she lived long enough and wrote clearly enough to tell her own story in her own words. She was not only a victim of her circumstances, though she was that too. She built something real inside a marriage that offered her almost nothing to build with. She raised 2 sons. She worked consistently for people less fortunate than herself, not as a gesture, but as a genuine commitment. She found love eventually, late enough that it must have felt like something recovered from a very long distance. And she told the truth about what had happened to her, carefully, without self-pity, in a book that remained in print for decades. That combination of things, survival, work, love found late, truth told plainly, is not a tragedy in the simple sense. It is something more complicated and, in its own quiet way, more enduring. The newspapers of 1895 had called it the wedding of the century. The bride who wept at the altar grew into a woman who outlived nearly everyone who had stood in that church, who outlived the Duke and his second wife, and the palace gossip, and most of the Gilded Age machinery that had produced her circumstances. She was the last one standing, and she had used the time well. That is not nothing. In the context of everything she had been put through, it is in fact quite a lot. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.